Well, good morning everyone, good afternoon, and even good evening. Today is Monday, and we have to go back to last week, however, because yesterday on Sunday we had our video about Mythic Plus tips to improve your performance, to improve your knowledge and your understanding of your surroundings in a Mythic Plus key, whether it is about enemies, about allies, whether it is about add-ons, Weakauras, UI improvements, or macros. So for today, we're going to have the follow-up, which is going to be raid related. So whether or not you are raiding at a lower level, you are pugging heroic, for example, maybe you are progressing heroic, maybe you are pugging mythic, even though cross faction is not out yet, or maybe you are progressing in mythic. There are going to be different layers of, of difficulty, of complexity, which also require more complex add-ons, more complex things. As we know, Blizzard has been developing raids with add-ons in mind for a while now, so many of these things are going to help you quite a lot, dealing with several of the mechanics in the raid. So, starting with some of the things we have talked about already in yesterday's video about Mythic Plus tips, we start with the main one, which is Weakauras. So, once again, opening our Weakauras, there is going to be a very similar thing to what we saw yesterday, which was the Mega Pack for the Shadowlands dungeon, which is the Sepulchre Mega Pack of Weakauras. This is much like the Shadowlands dungeon ones, where you get the whole list of mechanics, the whole list of abilities for all bosses to tell you what to do. There is a difference compared to what we saw yesterday. Mechanics in Mythic Plus are quite simple. If you see one of these icons pop up telling you to spread, to soak, to dodge, it's quite simple. The mechanics in Mythic Plus are going to be quite straightforward. The difference is that once you go into raid encounters, the mechanics start getting a little bit more complicated, a little bit more complex. They require more coordination with the rest of your group, etc, etc. So sometimes just a simple tiny icon is not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough to give you an idea of what you're supposed to do. For example, this one is the mechanic for the Celestial Collapse and the Manifest Cosmos. Once Manifest Cosmos comes up, you get the icon telling you to soak. That's it. That's the order. But what you can do with Weakauras, you can go up and instead take this Weakaura. This Weakaura is the Weakaura for Manifest Cosmos, except it's much more in-depth. It's going to tell you how long it takes for the cores to spawn. It's going to tell you when do you have to soak. It's going to be able to put you into an order of players who have to soak the cores. So it's going to be much more tidy, much more clean to understand the mechanic rather than just a simple icon. So yes, you can take, as I will leave behind the link, you can take the Mega Pack of Weakauras for the raids, but there are going to be some extra, more in-depth Weakauras. This one was for Rygalon. This one, for example, is the bait of the green paddles on Lords of Dread. You have the Blasphemy of Anduin, the Marks mechanic of Anduin, the Among Us phase of Lords of Dread, where you can vote players with this interface. So there are plenty of extra add-ons for all the different bosses, and there are more complicated mechanics that you can take with Weakauras. That's the main difference from the Weakauras of the Mythic Plus. Mythic Plus, you're mostly fine with just the icons and the more bare bones setting, whereas this one requires a little bit more of a complex layout for your Weakauras, which I'm gonna leave behind in the description as well. After Weakauras, we don't have as many of the previous add-ons that are going to be as needed. For example, Plater. Plater is not going to be as much of a needed add-on because there are not many nameplates you need to see in the raid, right? Mostly it's going to be one boss and a few ads. It's definitely not going to be as crowded and as busy as a Mythic Plus key. However, it might still be useful to have some clean and precise plates. For example, particularly if you are a spec that wants to multi-target and multi-hit, multi-dot, for example, multiple targets, it's quite handy to have nice and clean and visible target plates. Imagine fight like Prototype Pantheon, where there's going to be 2 bosses up and then later on 4 bosses up. Having good plates to allow you to target them and see what they have, what debuffs they have on them is going to be quite handful. Definitely not as needed, definitely not as much of a must as they are for Mythic Plus. That's for sure. After Plater, we have another one of the add-ons that can still be used in raid encounters like Mythic Plus that we haven't really talked about last time because it wasn't as important, which is Details. Details is going to be your damage meter, in fact, your combat log parser in game. It's more useful in the raid because in Mythic Plus, once you start the key, you have to go. You don't really have time to sit back and start analyzing what happened. But in raid encounters, if you wipe, you have a few minutes to look back at what happened. You can look back at who died in their death log, who died from what damage did they take, did they use their defensives, did they use their health potions, their health stones, what about damage taken. We really wanted to burst down this add, but this add didn't die, and we wiped. So you can go into details, look at enemy damage taken, and you can see who damaged that add to see who did their job and who didn't. So there are going to be quite a few options inside of details to check multiple things: healing taken, damage taken by abilities, enemy damage taken, interrupts, dispels. So there are plenty of things you can check. This is still not as in-depth as something like Warcraft logs, but if you want to do it in game, this is the best add-on for you to check how things are going in the raid. Details. Another one of the things that can be used in Mythic Plus as well, but it is quite more important in raid encounters, is of course bigwigs/DBM. So this is going to be your boss mod. This is going to be what you will use to make sure you highlight the most dangerous abilities, have them come up in a nice and tidy bar list or even a scrolling column, depending on your preference. So this is bigwigs in my case. You can use DBM. It's going to be about the same. You're going to go in raid bosses. You're going to select whichever boss you want. And then once you have selected the boss, you can start playing around with the abilities. You know, do you want the Berserk timer of Lords of Dread to show? Do you want the Rampaging Swarm to show or not? What about Cloud Carrion, which is very important? What about the AoE phase? You know, do you want them to have only a message in the middle of the screen but in a small font, or do you want it to be emphasized, to be much bigger at the top of the screen? Do you want it to have a sound or not? Do you want it to have a countdown or not? Which type of sound do you want for this? Okay, for this particular mechanic. So this is what bigwigs and DBM are going to allow you to do. You can change the color of the bars, you can change the size, whatever. It's always going to be quite important if you're raiding to take a look at this. Don't just download bigwigs or DBM and then just be, my job here is done, I have my boss mod, it's all good. Not really. There are going to be plenty of abilities in here. In this case, Lords of Dread, we can even go and check. I'm doing plenty of abilities that are just clutter, that are just going to make it more messy for you to understand what's going on, because you shouldn't care too much about them, or because they are very self-apparent. It's very obvious when they happen. For example, Domination Word of Pain. You don't need to see it, the timer for it, because it's quite obvious what's happening when it comes out. So you can disable a bunch of them to make it much clearer for you during an encounter to understand what happens. If you're curious about what this is, what you can do to make the boss mods work like this, it's in a Weakauras. Yes, once again, this is thanks to a Weakauras, which I'm leaving behind. It's going to transform everything you have set up in DBM or in bigwigs and turn it into a column with scrolling icons. So you can change the way you see the boss mod instead of bars into a single column. That's another thing you can do with Weakauras, provided you take one of these two boss mods. Another thing that we haven't talked about for Mythic Plus, this one entirely, is raid tools, renamed I guess into method raid tools. This is such an important tool. I even have my own button to make it show up like this. There is a very large list of things you can do in here. It looks quite hefty. Look at the amount of stuff you can check. You can do a Weakauras check to see which type of Weakauras the rest of your raid has, for example. You can do the log saving automatically with this system. You can check who ninja pulled. You can check the loot history of your entire raid roster, for example. You can check the raid attendance, timers, battle reses, marks, automatic marking depending on the fight, blah blah blah. A lot of this stuff is just for raid leaders. A lot of this stuff is just for officers and managers of the raid, but it can also be useful for you, lone guy or lone gal, without having to rely on a raid leader to make stuff up for you. The most important one is the raid cooldowns. It's what you see when I have my raid videos. In the bottom left, a list of raid cooldowns which you can select and then show up. This is going to allow you to select a bunch of abilities. You can find them easily based on this general sorting. Major raid cooldowns, for example, are going to be here. The single target cooldowns, the combat rest is available, the raid movement ones. You have dispel, stones, damage, heal, CC, basically everything you want. You can even search by class What this does is, for example, you can select all of the raid cooldowns you want and put them in column 1. Then you go into appearance, you go into column 1, you're going to enable column 1, choose where do you want to put it, how wide, how long do you want to put it, the font you want, and you're gonna make it show up. Then you can say, for example, I want my single target ones in a different column. So you can select all of them and select column 2. So that when you enable column 2, they're going to show up in a different column. This is going to allow you to keep track of things you might be interested in. If you're a tank, for example, if you're a tank, maybe external cooldown, being able to see the external cooldowns available is very good, because this way you can ask for them. It's kind of hard to ask for a pain suppression or to ask for a life cocoon if you actually don't know if the ability has been used yet as a tank. Same goes for a healer. You can keep track of the major raid cooldowns available to healers that way. You can look at combat rest is available, you can look at the raid movements to show up in the raid to see who has what, etc, etc. So you can keep track of this with this raid tool add-on. As I said, there are plenty of other tools you can use with this add-on. They are a little bit more in depth, they are a little bit more managerial in nature, so raid leaders, officers and whatnot are usually going to use them the most rather than just the single player. Lastly, talking about things you might have for the raid, it's another thing that we have talked about for Mythic Plus, but this gets a little bit more extensive because this is the macros once again. As we said, because the mechanics in the raid tends to be a little bit weirder, a little bit more complex, this also falls in line with having a bit more complex and a bit more specific macros you might want to use for different boss fights. One of the more important macros for raid encounters is making sure you get your interrupts correctly. So for example, when it comes to interrupt, you can use something like this. This macro is going to allow you to target a particular mob, cast your interrupt, and then target the previous target you had. You can do it either by hand like this, or you can do it with a focus macro. So for a focus macro, you can take your normal focus macro, which is this one. So when I click on any mob, it's gonna show up in the focus. If I click something else in the screen, it's gonna disappear. So I can just constantly change my focus. And then if you use this macro right here, all I have to do is click my interrupt. It's going to automatically target my focus, provided I have my focus target. It's gonna make it work like this. If you don't want the focus, then you can do it with this one. This one you have to manually target a particular mob with this macro. So for example, let's say you know you're fighting Anduin, you know you want to interrupt one of the adds of Anduin, so you have to type in the name here of the Anduin mob, and then you can do this macro. You're gonna interrupt it instantly and then immediately change back your target to Anduin. And this is gonna make it easier for you to interrupt. You won't have to start moving your mouse or your camera around to know where the enemy is. You can just use a macro. This can be used for plenty of things. You don't have to use this just for an interrupt. You can change Mind Freeze to whatever you want. Perhaps you're a multi-dot class. Perhaps you want this to work with Flame Shock, with Corruption, with Rapture, with Garrote. Literally anything you want, you can change it, and this is going to work the exact same. It's going to target automatically either your focus or the name you have put in the macro, and then go back to targeting your main target. These are the most used macros in the raid. There are of course plenty of other more baseline macros. For example, my Healing Rain has a cast on at cursor, which means I can just target my Healing Rain like this and it's gonna show up there. I don't have to double click the Healing Rain. I'm also gonna leave behind a pretty handy macro, specifically now that you can change multiple covenants every now and then. This one right here is a macro for every single covenant in the game. So what this does, very simply, is it's going to allow you to just have a single button for every single covenant ability. In this case, the button is Kyrian. It's the macro. It's going to work for Door Shadows, Soul Shape, Fleshcraft, and Summon Steward. So you can have them all for your non-combat ability, and then you can also have another macro for your combat ability, which is this one right here. This is going to be the exact same except for Vesper Totem, Chain Harvest, Primordial Wave, to make them cast according to your covenant. In my case, it's even a little bit more in-depth because I added a cursor addition to the Vesper Totem, so I don't have to double-click Vesper Totem, as well as a mouse over addition to Chain Harvest and Primordial Wave. This works as well. So This is also a pretty useful macro, in particular if you are one of the players who gets to change specs or change covenants all the time. This one is going to allow you to just keep 2 buttons for your covenant abilities and not have to worry about anything else, really. So I'm gonna leave behind the link for these macros as well. Now, with these macros being said, we have gone over most of the tips for raid encounters. So this was tip raiding Monday after tip mythic plussing Sunday. So I hope this helped. At least a few of these things you haven't kept track of before. I hope you will be able to introduce them to your UI now. With this being said, we can take a break for this Monday. Thank you guys again, of course, for watching and for helping to contribute to the growth of the channel, which also includes liking and commenting on this video as well as subscribing to the channel. Obviously, as is tradition, given that this one is a raid-centric video, I am going to allow to open the gates to the subscription button to all of the players who have already been raiding and already had most of my suggestions ready to go for the raiding time. Congratulations to all of you. That being said, it's time to leave. It's time to leave. Thank you guys again. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I don't know when it's time to stop drinking hot tea. It's starting to get a little bit summery outside for hot tea.